Hello, everybody. This is Hemi Bahar from the International Energy Agency. We are here to present the main results of the Renewables 2020 report, which we published last week. I am the main author of this publication and the project manager. I'm joined here by Paula Frankel, who is the head of division of renewable energies at the IEA, and the team who worked and analyzed and drafted this report is here to present several results. Without further ado, I would like to give the floor to Paolo. You can ask any questions in the Q&A box. We will be happy to reply to them after the presentation is over. Back to you, Paolo.
Thank you very much, Hemi, and a warm welcome to everybody also from my part from this webinar on the renewables market reports. Now, this report comes at a crucial time amidst of the first truly global energy crisis that is affecting every country and every technology, and the effects of which will be felt for years to come. Now, in this, and in terms of high energy prices and on energy security concerns, just to mention the two most important ones. In this context, one big question that emerged is the current crisis going to slow down the world clean energy transition? And recently at COP, there were a number of stakeholders being pretty vocal on a narrative that the goals of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees is actually becoming out of reach. Now, at the IEA, we have a clear position on this. It is difficult, maybe very difficult to achieve this target, but still not impossible. And on the contrary, we believe that this energy crisis has also an opportunity side, as all crises, and to become actually a turning point for a big acceleration into a more cleaner and more secure future world energy system. This is true for energy efficiency, this is true for heat pumps, and as you will see in a minute, this is even more true for renewables. So at the end, if you can scroll the slide, if we manage. Yes. At the end of the previous century, in the year 2000, the total installed capacity of renewables were around 850 gigawatt in the world, mostly of hydro. Since then, renewables have dramatically expanded, driven mainly by wind onshore and solar, and then more recently by wind offshore. And in the last 2 decades, they expanded by 2,400 gigawatts, so the triple of installed. Now, this is exactly the additional capacity of renewables to be installed in the next 5 years by the end of 2027. So it is a huge step change in the acceleration of renewables. 2,400 gigawatt is equivalent to the total power capacity of China, to give you an example, but it's a big change. And it is driven by 2 factors, energy security and pure economics, the competitiveness that are adding on the benefits of renewables in terms of climate change mitigation and environmental reduction. I turn it down again over to Hemi to give more details, starting from the fact that this has led the IEA to revise the forecast in an exceptional manner. Hemi, back to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. We will dig into the details of the report immediately, but I would like to start as well with the key message upfront before we move into the regional details and different sectors. We expect actually out of this 2,400 gigawatt capacity, the majority will come from solar PV. As you can see here, with this growth of solar PV, which is about 1,500 gigawatts, solar PV is bound to become the largest installed capacity worldwide, surpassing basically wind, natural gas, and coal in the coming 5 years. And also wind is growing, basically doubling its capacity. You can see it in the figure. It's almost an exponential continuous growth. While hydropower grows slowly, mostly in the developing and emerging economies. However, when we present capacity, we are criticized usually, what about generation? The answer is here. We expect renewables to become the largest generation of power systems globally by 2025, by early 2025, surpassing coal. And you can see visibly that by 2027, the power system is transformed drastically, and renewables are leading the power generation worldwide. There is obviously a different question, because the generation from PV and wind, which means variable sources, will expand rapidly, and their share will double in the next 5 years, which means that we are basically needing more and more flexibility in the systems which we advise countries to invest in. And as Paolo mentioned, I would like to go back to the countries now, because we will continue with some regional detailed discussion after this with my colleagues. As he mentioned, we revised a record level amount of capacity, our forecast, by about 30% compared to last year. And this is driven by mainly 4 economies: China, 14th five-year plan, which I will touch upon after this slide; European Union with the Repower EU, and also the country-level policies to achieve ambitious targets, which was also stimulated by energy security; and United States, the famous Inflation Reduction Act; and India, there's an important target that needs to be achieved. So this creates an important factor to do it. As Paolo mentioned, energy security becomes an important factor in many parts of the world to basically stimulate renewable capacity. We expect global renewable capacity growth to double compared to last 5 years. This important chunk is mostly driven by China. As you can see, China accounts almost half of the growth in the next 5 years. And one point about China, the growth will be mostly driven by policies that are at the provincial level, supported by the national ambitious target for wind and PV and share of renewable generation at the provincial level. Most of the growth is in quotation unsubsidized projects, which means that China phased out feed-in tariffs and auctions, national auctions for wind and PV over the last 2 years. In that sense, this growth is more organic, and which is driven by the provincial policies, and both on the distributed side, but also at the large-scale utility side, which will be coupled with decarbonization of the other sectors through hydrogen as well, which we will come back very soon. The motivation also continues for advanced economies on the energy security component, but also diversification from fossil fuel alternatives driven by the climate goals. And for emerging economies and developing countries, renewables are cheap, and they can basically help countries both to increase electrification when there is a need at the lowest cost, but also basically reduce the overall cost of the systems with especially wind and solar, which I will touch upon later. Now, the biggest hot region in the world because of Russia's war against Ukraine is Europe. And we will start with unfolding the forecast for Europe. Yasmina here with us to start discussing the context in Europe, which is basically a big change for us. And Yasmina, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Hamy. In the European Union, we're really seeing a step change in the pace of renewable capacity growth over the next 5 years. We're expecting about 350 gigawatts over the next 5 years to be deployed, which is more than twice as much as we saw in the previous 5-year period. And this is being driven by a need to achieve climate goals as well as improve energy security. This acceleration has resulted in us revising up the forecast by 34%, as mentioned previously. And this is because governments have taken specific policy actions to accelerate renewables to achieve those climate targets, and more recently, to reduce the reliance on imported fossil fuels after Russia's invasion of Ukraine. For example, Amy, if you will, we've seen the German government respond rapidly by increasing the renewable energy targets and increasing financial support specifically for distributed PV. That's caused us to revise up the forecast by about 50%. We revised Spain's forecast up by almost 60%, because there the government modified regulations to make environmental approvals happen quickly. Other governments also responded quickly by making policy changes such as extending net metering, improving auction designs, giving longer-term visibility over auctions. And in those markets, we've revised up the forecast as well. Now, that's not to say the region is without its challenges. Solar PV growth does face some downside risk due to labor shortages, potential supply chain disruptions, and onshore wind still does face some permitting challenges, long times to get approved in some markets. And if these challenges were addressed, though, we could see even faster growth in the EU, about 30% higher growth in our accelerated case. Thank you, Amy.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. Now, I would like to move into US, which also has a major policy change over the last few months, which for the first time we integrated in our forecast. And this is basically our view, and Trevor will explain it in a second.
Thank you very much, Amy. And it's important that we need to start by looking at what we were seeing last year. We were seeing an expiring wind production tax credit in 2022. We are a qualification for the PTC. We are also seeing declining or expiring investment tax credits for solar PV. Now, given these phase outs, this impacted the long-term forecast. However, fast forward to this year, and the Inflation Reduction Act has changed the situation extraordinarily. Amy, if you will. Now, just a quick note on 2022, we do see lower additions, and this is due to a couple of reasons. The first being trade restrictions for solar PV, the second being supply chain constraints for multiple technologies, including wind, and also this is in addition to lower incentives that were previously awarded. However, as we look out into the forecast, we can see a step change. Previously, the market had seen 1-year extensions, especially for wind, that gave very little policy visibility for developers. Now we have unprecedented policy consistency for up to 10 years, and these uncapped investment or production credits give developers certainty when developing a project. Now, due to the boom in growth, now the challenges in the market is facing are longer interconnection lead times, which have been increasing over the past few years, and transmission availability. However, overall, policy certainty in the US makes it the third largest market globally. And with over 280 gigawatts in the main case, this shows a marked step change in renewable energy development in the United States. Amy?
Thank you very much, Trevor. So US, as you can see in the figure, is a good example of how a policy can quickly change the trajectory of the renewable energy deployment. And now I would like to move to Asia Pacific region, which is basically a large region for renewables. Obviously, there are different countries, different sizes with different dynamics. It's a big region, but Piotr will try to explain very quickly our forecast in 2 slides for the region. Piotr, the floor is yours.
I do my best. Thank you, Amy. Asia Pacific region, excluding China, will expand its installed renewable capacity by 70% over the next 5 years. Thanks to low cost and relatively easy project development, solar PV is the main technology of choice. If you might, maybe click for another one. Yes. No. Yeah, thanks. Yes, solar PV will provide over 2/3 of all additions. And India will be responsible for 40% of region's deployment and will remain one of the global leaders of energy transition, driven by the target of 500 gigawatts of non-fossil capacity by 2030. Between 2022 and 2027, India will double its renewable capacity, led by utility-scale PV. The main driver of expansion are competitive auctions with increasingly important role of hybrid systems, combining multiple technologies to achieve higher flexibility of supply. About a quarter of all capacity awards in India in the last 2 years were for hybrid systems, making India the global leader of the solution. In Japan and Korea, renewables are expected to develop at similar pace as in the last 5 years. In Japan, we don't expect significant acceleration due to uncertainty resulting from transition from feed-in tariff scheme to feed-in premiums, while in Korea, due to permitting challenges limiting participation in auctions. Also, in both countries, the first large-scale offshore wind farms will come online before 2027. In ASEAN, annual renewables deployment will steadily accelerate towards 2027. Capacity growth in Vietnam is expected to slowly rebound after phase-out of feed-in tariffs, thanks to planned introduction of wind auctions and distributed PV growth. Auctions are also planned in Indonesia, and first ones were already conducted in Philippines, which will drive deployment led by utility-scale PV. For Australia, this year's forecast has been revised up by 30% compared to last year. The reasons for this are new auction announcements, new projects in renewable energy zones, and ambitious green hydrogen production plans. However, in accelerated case, renewables growth in Asia Pacific could be as much as 40% higher than in the main case, which is the highest upside potential among all regions. In India, faster uptake of distributed PV could be achieved through streamlining administrative procedures, providing incentives to distribution companies, and supporting the development of and improving the grid open access rules for commercial consumers. In case of onshore wind, fast implementation of planned changes in auction rules and quick introduction of planned support scheme for turbine repowering should accelerate the growth. Also, India has ambitious expansion plans for domestic PV manufacturing. Good coordination of PV demand and supply plans can lead to additional synergies, further driving the capacity growth. In ASEAN, countries like Indonesia, Philippines, and Thailand have so far mostly missed the benefits of low-cost solar and wind power, mostly due to limited policy support. Although we observed positive policy development in those countries, resulting, for example, in expected quadrupling of renewables growth in Indonesia and Philippines, still capacity additions could be much higher with more policy support. What could be done? Well, first, faster implementation of planned policies and expansion of auction capacity would translate to higher growth in Indonesia, Philippines, and Vietnam. Second is to create a long-term policy certainty, including higher renewable targets in national energy strategies, and limiting drastic changes in support policies should build investors' confidence and help in development of domestic supply chains. Such long-term visibility would allow to avoid difficult to manage boom-bust cycles like the one observed in Vietnam a few years ago. Third, facilitating permitting, easing local content requirements, and implementing standardized bankable PPAs should encourage local and international investment in ASEAN. In Australia, the upside potential is also huge, almost 50% higher deployment is possible, which can be achieved by expanding state-level auctions, faster grid investment, and also increasing policy support for green hydrogen production, which also translates to more investment in renewable capacity. Back to you, Jaime.
Thank you very much, Piotr, for this fascinating upside in the region where there are a lot of challenges, but there is also great potential in our accelerated case, which we take into account in this case. Latin America is a region that is basically very vibrant, has been for renewables. It's the region where one of the highest shares of renewables exists, especially due to hydro. Now, we also want to quickly describe our forecast in the region. Laura will give us a quick overview. Laura.
Thank you, Jaime. Renewable power capacity in Latin America is expected to increase by 45% from 2022 to 27. Most of it will come from solar PV and wind, which is a shift from hydropower, which dominates the historical trend, as you mentioned. As you will see in the right chart, in 2022, we see lower than usual auction volumes. Most auctions this year were undersubscribed. This is because reference prices remain almost unchanged, while bid prices had to increase to reflect higher costs and higher commodity prices. And this was both for PV and wind technologies. However, the situation was offset by higher number of PPAs, which we expect will increasingly drive the expansion in the region. For instance, in Brazil, bilateral contracts are one of the drivers of expansion as industries aim to meet decarbonization goals. If we analyze country to country, we see two key trends. On one hand, some countries have strong and ambitious renewable energy policy, which create an attractive environment for investors. For instance, this is the case of Brazil and Chile, which together account for 3/4 of the growth. On the other hand, there are other countries that are dealing with macroeconomic uncertainties, as Argentina, or that face changing policy schemes. Utility scale has a major role in the renewable sector, but distributed PV is a key element as well, with 20% of the total growth, as you can see in the first chart. This is clearly led by Brazil, where a lot of installations came online this year in a rush to benefit from the current net metering scheme that will end at the end of this month. Our forecast considered that this market will continue growing, but at lower speed, as the new installations will receive less compensation, but still they will remain economically attractive. There are great resources for renewable energy in Latin America, and we see that in both our main and accelerated case. Yet there are some challenges that need to be addressed. These are faster deployment and permitting, regulatory certainty, and also resolution of grid integration challenges. Our accelerated case considers that if this is improved, 20% more renewables could be added. Thank you, Jaime. Back to you.
Thank you very much, Laura. Now, let's move to another important region where probably the cheapest renewables are contracted for various reasons, Middle East and North Africa. And I'll let Yasmina quickly describe the trends that we see in the coming 5 years.
Thank you, Jaime. In the MENA region, we're seeing a tripling in the speed of renewable growth, with about 45 gigawatts expected to come online in the next 5 years, which is more than 3 times higher than 15 gigawatts we saw in the previous 5-year period. Now, this surge is being driven by solar PV due to the increasing competitiveness of it in the region. And that factor is really creating a market shift, creating a dynamical change between the 2 time periods. If you look in the previous 5-year period, you see growth being driven by UAE, Morocco, and Egypt. But now going forward in the next 5 years, Jaime, if you will, you'll see growth spreading out to new markets, so Saudi Arabia and Oman, and higher growth in the UAE. And this is because solar PV is becoming increasingly economically attractive, which is being achieved because the region has good solar resources. Projects are large and can take advantage of economies of scale. And most of the time they have access to very beneficial financing rates. And this region, as Jaime mentioned, is achieving some of the lowest recorded bid prices in the world, below $20 per megawatt hour. Now, this low-cost solar PV electricity is also one of the reasons why hydrogen is becoming a driver for new capacity growth in the region. In fact, we're expecting about 14% of renewable capacity to come from hydrogen plants in the next 5 years, and most of that will be in Saudi Arabia and in Oman. Again, this region is not without its challenges. Onshore wind does face long lead times and limited resource availability mapping, which could help develop new projects. CSP also has long lead times, and there's limited visibility over future auctions for that technology as well. Thank you, Jaime.
Thank you very much. Now, another important region, which is probably deploying renewables way below its actual potential, considering all renewable technologies, including hydropower, solar PV, wind, geothermal, bioenergy, all of them. And we have some good news from the region, and I will let Trevor to give details about that.
Yeah, we're very excited about the potential for renewables in sub-Saharan Africa. And in fact, we have revised our forecast of nearly 7 gigawatts from last year. Now, almost 5 gigawatts is from wind and solar PV exclusively. Now, before we get into those technologies, I do want to point out that hydro still is important throughout the continent, especially in countries like Ethiopia and Tanzania, where it will be the bulk of the renewable energy capacity additions. However, with the increase in PV and wind, we are seeing a shift in technology drivers. And if you will, the previous 5 years, hydro accounted for over 50% of new renewable energy capacity additions throughout the market. However, if we look out to the forecast period, we see that PV and wind account for over 60% of the new additions. Amy. And why is this? We're starting to see countries partnering with international organizations for tenders for PV. Countries are partnering with foreign governments for projects, especially large-scale wind projects. But the largest driver is policy, and it's driven by South Africa, the largest market in the region. The 2 new auctions that they have held and awarded in the past few years have really driven up the amount of utility-scale wind and solar PV. Now, on solar PV, I also want to touch on another trend that we've been seeing, which is the diversification of segments. In the past 10 years, utility scale has really been the driver of PV additions. Moving forward in the forecast period, while utility scale is still the largest amount of PV additions, we're starting to see more commercial scale systems, residential scale systems, in addition to off-grid systems as well. Now, this is again due to policies such as the net metering pilot program in Kenya, or the lifting of the embedded generation cap and net metering in South Africa. So again, this really reiterates the importance of policy in renewable energy development. Having firm policy in conjunction with transmission and distribution upgrades will further boost investor confidence in the region and achieve our accelerated case of nearly 55 gigawatts. Amy?
Thank you very much, Trevor. Now we are done with more or less with the electricity section. We will switch back to some of the topics related to electricity after we cover biofuels, because we have some special topics that we basically covered in the report. As you can see, the famous chapter 4, Trends to Watch. We will cover them just after the biofuel section. And I would like to give the floor to Jeremy to cover in the next 3 slides the biofuel trends that we see. Jeremy.
Thank you. So for the forecast period this year from 2022 to 2027, we're seeing robust growth for liquid biofuels. So these are biofuels that are mixed with transportation fuels. We're seeing an interesting divide as well between advanced economies and the types of fuels that are driven there, and then in emerging economies. In advanced economies, demand is almost completely for renewable diesel and biojet fuel. And this is driven by greenhouse gas policies in the United States, as well as in Europe. These types of fuels are becoming more popular and under more demand because they help reduce greenhouse gas emissions. They can be blended at very high levels, and they can also be made from wastes and residues, which get extra value in some markets. Now, in emerging economies, we're seeing a different trend. Demand is almost exclusively for ethanol and biodiesel. And these fuels are growing the most in Brazil, Indonesia, and India over the forecast period. Now, this year, we took these fuels and we looked at, well, what are the materials that are being used to make these fuels? And we see this divide here again as well. So some fuels in advanced economies are coming from crops. These are things like sugarcane, like maize, soybean oils. But most of that demand is coming from waste and residues, things like used cooking oil and animal fats. If we move to emerging economies, it's a different story. Most of that demand is coming for crops such as soybean oil, palm oil, and sugarcane. Now, globally, the total picture, 1/3 of new biofuels production is going to be supported using waste and residues. And so these supplies are under more and more demand around the world. Now, if we look, there's a lot of upside across scenarios. Biofuel growth is very policy driven, and there's 4 big policy discussions around the world right now that would more than double total growth in our forecast. The first is in the United States. So this year we saw the introduction of the Inflation Reduction Act, which is in the numbers I just showed you. But the United States right now is considering increasing or allowing for 15% ethanol blending across the country. And there's also provisions in the Inflation Reduction Act that can be used to help build out the infrastructure that would be needed to achieve that. So if companies decide to pursue that, there's a lot of growth potential in the United States. The second market to watch is Europe, especially the European Union. There's revisions to the Renewable Energy Directive across the EU right now. And if member states adapt their policies to meet those changes, that's 6 times more growth in the European Union than we had before. Oh, sorry, I skipped over China. Go back to China, which is the light green one. For China, in its most recent 14th five-year plan, there are commitments to accelerate the deployment of advanced biofuels across the country in support of its net zero targets. However, we haven't yet seen the actual policies that would lead to that. But based on some of the analysis that the IEA has done, there's lots of potential for biofuels in China if it decides to pursue that path. And finally, in India, India has a biodiesel target for 5% by 2030, which it hasn't put the policies in place yet to support. And it's also putting in new initiatives to help accelerate ethanol demand across the country. If those policies come into place, then we could see a real acceleration in India as well. And there's some potential in other markets as well, such as Indonesia, Malaysia, and Thailand. Now, one of the things we did this year, I've showed some information on it, but is really dig into where are these materials going to come from to provide this growth? And are there any supply crunches we can see around the world? So I'll look at ethanol first, some of the 2 products that are used to make ethanol, maize and sugarcane. When we look at both of those products and look at the total demand going to biofuels as a share of total production around the world, it's fairly flat over the forecast for maize and sugarcane. And what that means is there's not a huge amount of pressure on these resources. Demand for ethanol is increasing, but so is production of maize and sugarcane at about the same pace. But where we're starting to see an issue is on vegetable oils. Over the forecast, the share going to produce renewable diesel, biojet fuel, and biodiesel goes up from 17% to 23% in just a few years. And this is important because these fuels are critical on a net zero pathway to help reduce emissions from aviation and areas that are hard to decarbonize, like heavy trucking. And so we're concerned there may be a supply crunch happening in this area. And if we looked at those waste and residues as well, things like used cooking oil and animal fats that have very low greenhouse gas intensity, over our forecast periods out to 2027, we can exhaust a lot of those easy to access supplies. Now, I don't want to end on a negative note. There are ways around this supply crunch. One of the areas we're looking at here is the total potential of different supply options, different feedstock options for biofuels. Existing production is this light blue box. There's potential for further development from sustainable crops, as well as this used in cooking oils and animal fats. There's quite a bit of growth potential there, but that's not enough to get us onto a net zero trajectory. And we're already starting to see this pressure on especially on some of the oils. Another area for focus for governments and companies to look at are what we call the new and compatible feedstocks. So these are raw materials on areas like marginal land or cover crops that are compatible with existing technologies, but they're not development that's really being pursued right now. So there's a lot of potential there that we need to explore to help get out of this supply crunch. And then finally, there's new production technology pathways that allow biofuel producers to access this broad base of waste and residues around the world, from things like forestry waste, agricultural waste, municipal solid waste, that can be used for other resources, but have the potential to help expand biofuels as well. Thanks very much, Amy.
Thank you. The summary of the biofuels was very interesting for me in multiple ways, Jeremy, both the trend, especially towards the waste products, which is a good news, and challenges that come with it. So this year, as every year, we covered special topics related to renewable energy markets, one of which was actually feedstocks that Jeremy just covered. The other one, which is the question that is being asked by everybody in Europe and several other parts of the world as well, about the windfall profits. Are renewables making windfall profits in Europe? We try to look at it, this question in a different way, try to understand the situation in a balanced way, both on the policy and the utility situation side. And it's a difficult answer to this question. It's actually a complicated answer. And I will let Kartik to try to summarize this complicated situation in 2 minutes. Thanks, Kartik.
Thank you, Amy. So to answer this question, first we need to look at the renewable energy policies that can provide us the insights on whether the developers are actually eligible to receive the higher revenues from the market. So in the EU, policy schemes are enable more than 50% of RE capacity to be eligible to receive wholesale energy prices. Now, this is mainly due to the largely amortized hydropower plants, which account for 1/4 of the EU installed capacity. Now, in the absence of long-term fixed price bilateral contracts, these hydropower plants could be able to get wholesale electricity price, for instance, using hedging strategies. However, when we exclude the hydropower, policies enabling wholesale market exposure is under 50% for wind and bioenergy and under 40% for solar PV. Now, this is because a significant majority of these projects for these technologies are under feed-in tariff, classical feed-in tariff schemes. Now, while small remainder portion are under former green certificate program or a feed-in premium scheme like in Germany that we see, and these enable these technologies to benefit from high spot market prices. Now, if we look at the non-policy factors, we need to understand these, that we examine the financial reports of some oil and gas majors and European utilities with large operational renewable and fossil fuel capacities. Now, all the energy companies, including the major utilities that we examined, reported significant higher revenues in the first half of 2022 than the 2021. But for major utilities, higher revenues came also with higher costs due to higher fuel prices. Now, in case of some utilities, like in Group A, exposure to the retail and customer business, along with the lower hydropower and nuclear output, reduced their profitability. Some utilities, as in Group B, made higher profits than the last year using hedging strategies and long-term contracts. But hedging strategies does not always lead to higher profits, as it depends if the utility is actually able to secure higher prices than the average sale price per megawatt hour in advance. So as for the profits of oil and gas majors, as you see in the graph, it doubled. It doubled in the first half of 2022 from the same period last year. So to conclude, while remuneration policies may enable renewable energy generators to tap into the wholesale market to receive higher revenues, non-policy factors make it uncertain to evaluate actual amount the governments could eventually collect. So additionally, an important point to note here is that market interventions discussed at the EU and the country levels must shelter the citizens from higher costs, but without hurting the business case of new renewable energy investments. Thanks. Back to Amy.
Thank you very much, Kartik. So we try to provide a bit of a balanced view by both looking at policies and basically the financials of some top 10 utilities in this case. More details are in the report. You can take a look at which companies we analyzed. But this topic will continue to come back to the agenda, in my opinion, in the coming months, especially with the price caps or the market correction mechanisms that the European Union is implementing. we will see how the situation unfolds for renewables. But one message that Kartik gave it very clearly, which I think is very important, that these measures should not prevent the capacity of the companies to reinvest in renewable projects which are needed to tackle the climate change. Now moving into another interesting topic about solar PV manufacturing. Many of you may remember in July this year, we basically released the solar PV supply chain report. And one of the important findings of the report was the increasing share of single country dependence of the world, which we expected at the time to go up to 95%, especially for critical segments of the supply chain in 2025. However, since then, many things have changed, and I will let Trevor and Piotr to discuss these many changes and how we see possibly their impact on the solar PV manufacturing sector.
So thank you, Hemi. And as we discussed in the solar PV supply chain report, China and the ASEAN region produced the most cost-effective solar PV modules. And it's up to other markets to address these cost gaps, especially for some of the variable costs, in order to diversify the supply chain. Now, two markets are starting to do this. One is in India, and the second is the United States, but they're going about it in different ways. Before I get into some of the details, India has a PLI scheme, which is targeting investment across the value chain, while the United States Inflation Reduction Act has production credits for production of certain solar components. So before we begin, you can see that there are significant differences between these markets and the lowest cost markets for investment in India and for production in the United States. So starting with the PLI scheme is addressing this investment gap by covering nearly 80% of the cost gap between these two markets. Now, as a result, the amount of investment for the 65 gigawatts that is supported by the scheme is less. Moving to the United States, the production credit is via a tax rebate or tax equity for materials such as polysilicon, wafers and ingots, cells and modules, both thin film and crystalline silicon. Now, each component has a different incentive value that allows companies to apply to their market segment. But as a result, manufacturing in the United States could become competitive with the lowest cost manufacturing if all incentives are fully monetized. Now, these programs are coupled with trade measures and domestic content premiums for developers have led to numerous project announcements, and diversification, which my colleague Piotr will discuss.
Yes, those new policies implemented in India and the United States, as described by Trevor, are expected to result in tripling of PV manufacturing investment outside China in the next 5 years. In result, geographical diversification of PV production will significantly increase. What is important, the investment will cover all crystalline silicon PV manufacturing steps, from polysilicon through wafers and cells to complete PV modules, as well as thin film technology. In effect, India and the United States become significantly more self-reliant in terms of PV supply. In result of these investments, as well as local content premiums and trade measures mentioned by Trevor, China's share in global production could shrink from current 70 to 90%, depending on supply chain stage, to about 60 to 70% in 2027. At the same time, the biggest expansion plans still come from China, which is planning to double its manufacturing capacity by 2027. With all those investment plans, PV manufacturing capacity growth might significantly outpace global demand growth, even in our accelerated case scenario. This could lead to decreasing global manufacturing capacity utilization across the whole supply chain to about 30% in 2027, which is about half of current levels. This overcapacity may put a downward pressure on PV prices, but also on manufacturers' profitability. So the supply glut could create a fierce competition between the manufacturers and still cause investors to cancel many of those manufacturing expansion projects, both within and outside of China. Back to you, Jaime.
Thank you very much, Piotr. And we will see every day or every week a new project coming from where the policies are. I like to remind all the audience that the reason why we have this this share of one single country in the solar PV manufacturing is also due to long-term policy strategies that China implemented, chosen PV as a strategic sector since over almost 2 decades. So now the other countries are also started to do a similar policy structure. Moving into another interesting topic, especially in these cold days we are having in Europe, where everybody is asking this question about gas supplies and then how we can replace Russian gas, especially next year. We have released a report on this, but I think it's important to look at overall the heat markets a little bit to understand. And we also did a bit of a topical aspect on this one about the heat pumps in Europe and their competitiveness under the current electricity and gas price situation. And Francois will start with the global trends on renewable heat markets and move into the specific topic that we covered this year. Francois.
Thank you very much, Jaime. Let me talk a bit about heat, and indeed the heat sector deserves a specific attention. Just let me recall the context. Today, half of global final energy consumption is used for heating, mostly in industry for process heat, and in the building sector for space and water heating and cooking. And as you can see on this figure, heat supplies are still massively dominated by fossil fuels. And this means considerable CO2 emissions. Renewable sources altogether supply less than a quarter of global heat demand, and about half of this renewable fraction are inefficient uses of biomass, the so-called traditional use of biomass, which can lead to adverse environmental, social, and health impacts. And what we call modern uses of renewables includes efficient bioenergy use, for instance, in stoves and boilers, solar thermal, geothermal, but also indirect consumption of renewable through electricity and district heating. And it should also include ambient heat harnessed by heat pumps, but we could not show it here on the figure due to data unavailability. So if we exclude ambient heat, all these modern renewables in 2021 represented just over 11% of total heat consumption, and that's not even 3 percentage points above what we had 10 years ago. So we are having a critical situation here. And one of the reasons for this state of fact is that most often heat received little policy attention in the past compared to other end-use sectors. But things are starting to change. The global energy crisis is moving energy security concerns up in the political agenda of many countries, and since last year, we are seeing quite interesting policy updates. Just to mention a few major ones from key heating markets, we have the US Inflation Reduction Act, which offers substantial rebates and tax credits to households for renewable heat appliances. We have the REPower EU plan in the EU, which has provisions for industry electrification, for the use of renewables in district heating, and for large-scale deployment of heat pump in the building sector. And we have also China, who announced its 5-year plan target for non-fossil fuel share and for non-electric use of renewables, and which offer provisions for clean heating and air pollution control measures. So now the question is, can this new policy environment change the heat landscape? Well, let's now have a look to an outlook to the next 5 years. By 2027, you can now look at the figure on the right. By 2027, we expect global renewable heat consumption to grow by about 30%. However, as you can see on this figure, we expect contrasted trends, in buildings and industry. In buildings, the progression of renewables displaces traditional use of biomass and fossil fuels, and the share of modern renewables is expected to reach almost 16% of the total heat demand. In industry, however, it's a different game. Increasing activity could lead to a 15% increase in heat demand by 2027, and that demand growth would largely outpace renewable heat developments. This means increasing fossil fuel consumption, and this will contribute to an overall 7% growth in total annual heat-related CO2 emissions. And that will lead to almost 19 gigaton of cumulated heat-related CO2 emissions over the period. That's massive. This stresses the urgent need to contain heat demand in both sectors, including through energy and material efficiency and wide-scale behavioral change. Can we move to the next slide, please? Thanks. If we now look in the detail of renewable heat growth, what we see is that the largest contribution to this growth comes from the use of renewable electricity. And this is the case not only in the building sector, but also in the industry, which is a new trend. Can you please click, Amy? Thanks. As you can see now on the right figure, this progression of renewable electricity use is due to the combination of two key factors. The first one is increasing reliance on electricity for heating, the blue fraction of the figure. And this is especially the case with process heat electrification using heat pumps and direct electric processes in non-energy intensive industries. And this trend is most significant in China, but also in the EU and the United States. And in buildings, it comes from the accelerated rollout of heat pumps in the same regions. And the second factor is the rising share of renewables in power generation, which has spillover effect on the heat sector. So now, if you look back to the left figure, you can see that in both sectors, in industry and building, the second largest growth in renewable heat consumption comes from bioenergy use. In industry, this comes from greater use of biomass in the sugar and ethanol industry, especially in Brazil and India, but also biomass in the food and beverage subsector. And we also expect growing use of biogenic waste in the cement subsector in West, Middle, and Eastern African countries. In building, most of the bioenergy developments are expected in China, India, and Sub-Saharan Africa, and this is due to improved biomass cook stoves displacing the traditional use of biomass. Let me just make a last point on this renewable heat outlook. Let me also mention solar thermal, which consumption is projected to increase almost 40% in the building sector by 2027, with China, the Middle East, and the EU and the USA being the major markets. Back to you, Amy, or no, we will.
We are still with you about the.
All right, let me continue so on the heat pump and how this energy crisis is shaping a different environment for heat pump and other heat options. So heat pumps, as I said, have benefited recently from growing policy momentum in a number of countries, particularly in the United States and in Europe. Heat pumps are expected to help reduce fossil fuel dependency and CO2 emission in the heating sector by enabling energy saving and supply diversification. But there are still a number of obstacles to large-scale heat pump deployment, and chief among them is the cost competitiveness of heat pumps in places where lower-cost fossil fuel alternatives have not yet been banned. The cost competitiveness of heat pumps depends on initial investment costs, on operating and maintenance costs, including fuel, and on equipment durability and the presence or not of economic incentives. And for heat pumps, like most renewable technologies, generally we have high upfront costs and rather low running costs in comparison to fossil fuel options. And now, if we take the context of the energy crisis had a dramatic impact on energy price since last year, and depending on regions, markets, and tarification designs, these price hikes on the markets are partly passed on to household consumers. If you look at the figure on the left, you can see the relative price change in the average relative price change for gas and electricity for consumer price from the first semester of 2021 to the first semester of 2022. Sorry for the typo in the title. And as you can see, the residential consumer tariff for gas have risen more quickly than for electricity in major heating markets, and this is particularly true for countries such as Denmark and Sweden. So now, how does this energy price change impact the cost competitiveness of heat pump versus gas boiler? Well, if you look now on the right figure, you can see the levelized cost of heating calculated with typical market prices for technologies and for different regions, for an average household size, for heat pumps, air water heat pump, and gas boiler. And the capital expenditures are shown in orange, and the operating costs are shown in blue, with the light blue being the impact of 2022 price compared to 2021 price. And as you can see, in Denmark and Sweden, the cost competitiveness of gas-fired boilers deteriorated substantially when gas price rose during the first half of 2022. The gap has just increased significantly. Can you click? Thanks. However, the problem is that in most countries, the overall cost competitiveness of heat pumps versus gas boiler is still determined mainly by the significant investment cost difference between the two. In the residential sector, high investment costs are a major barrier because financing can be a challenge for many households. In the past year, though, many countries have strengthened investment support for heat pumps or introduced new measures, and that was often in response to the energy crisis and in the European Union to reduce dependence on Russian gas. This investment support has been in the form of grants. That's the most common type of policy support we can find. It is also in the form of tax credits, of reduced tax rates, and of specific loan schemes. And the level of support sometimes depends on the household revenue, and in some countries it can substantially reduce or even offset the upfront cost with gas boilers, sometimes making heat pumps more economical for consumers than gas boilers over the lifetime. And this can be the case, for instance, if you look at the figure for France, for Italy, and for United States, depending on the assumptions. In other countries, however, like what you see for the United Kingdom, investment support may not be enough to make up for high upfront costs and for low gas tariffs. The good news is that this upfront costs for heat pumps are expected to decline gradually over this decade, because markets expand, because suppliers will benefit from economies of scale, and because we expect also greater competition to put pressure on prices. But in the medium term, investment support will remain critical in many key heat markets to enable a wider scale heat pump deployment. Let me also mention that in addition to direct public investment support, alternative business models like on-bill financing, leasing, energy performance contract, or heat as a service can also play a pivotal role in reducing or eliminating investment obstacles for households. And finally, just let me conclude on that, because each house and application have their own specificities in terms of building insulation, in terms of heat distribution system, of space constraints, or of local energy source availability. Other renewable heat options, such as solar thermal or bioenergy, may sometimes be easier or more economical to implement. So this stresses the importance of careful policy design, as well as the importance of supporting households with independent audits to inform heating system replacement decisions. Thank you very much, Amy.
Thank you very much, Francois. And I would like to note that there are questions coming, and I think people are asking questions before the slides. We are slowly answering them while people speak. One of the questions, for instance, is about EU push for PV and why not for building installation. So that question is partly answered by Francois to show the competitiveness and main obstacles why faster growth is not happening, showing a lot of European country examples. And indeed, the most of the COVID recovery funds in Europe and the new policies are acting towards the building sector, but transforming the building sector is more challenging than installing solar PV plants, especially at the utility scale and distributed level. So there's a big difference into that. And now the next slide is actually an answer to another question that is being asked on hydrogen, green hydrogen, which is also a new analysis that we conducted this year for the first time, looking at renewables for renewable capacity for hydrogen production. And the question was exactly asking this, whether the scale up of hydrogen production can eat up some of this oversupply, PV oversupply that Piotr just mentioned. And now let's look at the hydrogen, green hydrogen sector. Yasmina.
Thank you, Jaime. So yes, renewable hydrogen is receiving increased attention, not just from policymakers, but also from you, as I can see in the Q&A. And that's because hydrogen is emerging as a new energy vector to help achieve decarbonization goals, as well as increase energy security. Now, today, renewable hydrogen makes up less than 1% of total hydrogen production, but we expect that to increase in the coming years because governments are starting to include it in its long-term plans. Therefore, we do expect hydrogen to become a driver for new renewable capacity growth. In fact, we expect it to account for about 2% of renewable capacity growth we expect to come from hydrogen plants, led by China, followed by Australia, in Chile in terms of single markets. So it's about 50 gigawatts of renewable capacity dedicated to hydrogen production we expect coming online in the next 5 years, almost evenly split between solar PV and onshore wind. Now we see about 2 types of markets emerging, those that are producing renewable hydrogen for domestic supply, so it's China, Europe, and the United States. This is for decarbonization of heat and transport. Then we have another set of markets, Australia, MENA, and Chile, which are producing renewable hydrogen for ammonia to export to Asia and Europe. And this is because in these markets, you have an enabling environment where you've got low-cost electricity from solar PV and wind, you've got land, and you also happen to be located along strategic shipping routes. And so in these markets, as Amy just showed you, we expect hydrogen to make up or to play a much larger role in renewable capacity growth. Upwards of 10% of the renewable capacity growth in these export markets will be dedicated to hydrogen production. Now, in all of these markets, both sets, government support in the form of financial incentives is critical to bringing projects to advanced stages of development and financial close, and securing off-takers. The rate at which they can do that is going to play a key role in how fast renewable hydrogen can scale up and the associated renewable capacity with it. Thanks, Amy.
Thank you very much, Yasmina. Now the next slides answer another question that is being asked, whether we are on track with net zero or not. Thank you very much for this critical question. This is a snapshot from the electricity sector. Many of my colleagues mentioned to you the upside potential in the accelerated case in their regions. They add up to 25% higher than our main case. Mainly coming from solar PV and wind, but some upside also from the faster commissioning of the hydropower projects. Whether this is in line with net zero or not is another question mark, which we track. And the gap is still there, but it's narrowing significantly, and especially for solar PV. Solar PV trajectory, especially in the accelerated case, is getting close to the net zero needs in our forecast. That's why we are calling it narrowing the gap. But for wind, the situation is a bit more complicated. Both Yasmina and Trevor mentioned in their sections about the US and Europe, the wind plants are facing several challenges in terms of long permitting lead times and social acceptance issues in many parts of Europe and some parts of the United States. So this obviously creates a big issue in terms of accelerating the growth of onshore wind projects. There's also some upside on offshore wind, obviously, but the time scale that we have in the forecast doesn't allow significant amount of additional capacity to come forward. So the positive deployment in our forecast, especially in the accelerated case, on faster permitting, grid and system integration challenges, and enabling affordable financing in developing countries is getting closer us to the net zero, but we are not there. I think more needs to be done. And this is the optimistic picture of electricity. Obviously, in transport and heat, the situation is much more complicated. And there has been some questions on heat in the chat, and my colleague Francois is, I see that, typing the answer to that question. And it is a complicated situation for the decarbonization of the heat, but as we mentioned, there are a lot of new technologies and new deployments such as hydrogen, ammonia, and so on and so forth to be able to decarbonize the difficult heat sector. And the presentation is now over. We will move into some of the questions. There are some of them that are already written and answered. And the team is here. You can see I would like to highlight also one important point, that all the data that we presented, both on electricity, heat, and transport, is freely available in our website. You can visualize it, both main and accelerated cases, by region, by technology, by fuel, in whatever form. This is an excellent tool for those who want to look at the forecast. Our forecast over the last few years, actually, not only this year. You can compare and contrast and see transparently what is in our data set. And I'm sure this will help a lot of people that are on the webinar who are interested in this one. There is one question related to the wind companies and their financial situation. I will zoom out a little bit to bring Paolo in as well. He may want to jump in on this one. The situation for the wind companies is complicated. We are following very closely their financials in terms of the over the last year, how it developed, their profitability. And wind sector, as I mentioned, is way more complicated in terms of deployment than solar PV, because of the permitting regime that is in, because of the height mostly, and the social acceptance issues. And supply chain situation made which is also globally distributed, a bit complicated. And I mean, we are mentioned that the dependency on China on the majority of the solar PV production, of course, this also created several supply chain issues, but wind supply chain is even more complicated because the parts are distributed all around the world, and several wind companies have been facing these challenges. However, one important point about policies that can actually help for the wind companies is the auction design. And currently, the auction design in many parts of the world is raised to the bottom in terms of the price. But obviously, this has been an important factor to make renewables competitive with fossil fuels and reduce the costs. However, there is a certain limit to this auction design. Maybe Paolo would like to also raise some issues. So price is obviously an important factor, but there can be obviously other factors that should be included maybe in the future auction designs as a policy suggestion. And I'll hand maybe to Paolo to continue the answer.
Yeah, thank you, Jaime, and thank you for this question, because it is true that the wind industry is facing a more difficult and delicate moment than, for instance, solar PV or in general. Now, I don't want to raise more issues, but I would rather put it in the way of a recommendation for policymakers everywhere to put attention to the following 3 points. The first is wind is suffering from longer permitting authorization procedures than other technologies. So finding ways to reduce this permitting and authoritative process is a very important point. It is also facing social acceptance more than solar, for instance. So this is number one. The second is what Jaime said on auctions. Just to be very clear, auctions have been phenomenally effective to foster competition and to decrease cost of renewables in a fantastic way over the last decade and even more than a decade. Now, however, in the current context, when commodity prices are higher, so the cost of producing renewables and in particular wind is higher, and in the moment where auctions of renewables are massively cheaper in principle than fossil fuel prices, I think government should have in mind to relax some of these conditions and of this competition, and to try to have as a real goal for auctions to give a fair, reasonable remuneration to the wind, in particular for the wind sector, but in general for the renewables producers. And my third point, it goes to supply chain. And here I am looking in particular at the European industry, and to some extent also the United States. Europe has a leading position in the wind industry, And I think it's should be a matter of attention to make policy measures that defend, that somehow protect this sector, which is particularly in a delicate situation right now. So I think these are three issues that deserves very attentive policy attention from policymakers, in particular in Europe. Wind remains a fundamental pillar of the clean energy transition, a very competitive technology, but it needs policy attention right now.
Thank you very much, Paolo. There was another question related to the forecast and its relation to World Energy Outlook scenarios and the global net zero scenario that IEA has. I think the slide answered the question on net zero, how we compare it. Just to give you a ballpark idea of how these are related. So our main case will be in line with the steps scenario of solar PV in the short term. You won't be able to see exactly the same numbers because we produce in different times. And we are basically updated the forecast after World Energy Outlook is published. But those are more or less interacting with each other in the model that we have here at the IEA. To short term and long term, so they are feeding into each other. So we can expect similar numbers, not exactly the same as I mentioned, because we publish in different times. In terms of the APS, announced policy scenario, this is a complicated. So our accelerated case, I haven't compared it yet, to be honest with you, but it's between net zero and steps, so which is like APS. So you could possibly say that it's somewhere in the ballpark. But our accelerated case is not based on a scenario modeling exercise that our World Energy Outlook colleagues are doing. Is mostly on a policy setting that we have in the main case, and if those challenges are addressed, what kind of upside we can see. Globally, maybe it falls into the ballpark, but for some country level information, we are analyzing it country by country, so it will be slightly different when you dig into the country level information on this one. There is a question maybe Trevor would like to answer about the grid in the United States. I think you mentioned quickly the grid constraints in the United States as a challenge. Maybe you want to expand a bit the question that is asked. Trevor.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Thank you, Hami. And I think the audience member is discussing a question with a specific project called Northern Pass in the United States. And in terms of the development of transmission and its connection to renewable energy development, as we discussed in the report, there is legislation that is currently being considered, the Energy Independence and Security Act, that would help aid transmission development. Now, it's important to note that there are areas in the market that are transmission constrained, and there are examples of projects that have been built in conjunction with transmission lines. However, this is not unique to the U.S. market. This happens worldwide, and it's up to state. For the U.S. case, it's up to federal, state, local governments, as well as TSO providers to help ease that transmission development and that upgrade to help bring that new renewable capacity online.
Thanks, Trevor. Paolo would like to add a note. And Paolo, I will attach another question to this because there's another one about the grid expansion in general and the permitting around grid expansion. So if you can also answer that, because in many markets, including the emerging economies, this is a big issue. Without grids, renewables don't exist. So what could be some of the things that governments should do to expand grid as well?
First, I wanted to just expand on this, because this is not an issue in the United States, but I would say everywhere, in advanced countries as in emerging countries. And it is a matter of fact that with the massive and fast deployment of renewables, and in particular variable renewables like PV and wind, this is a double issue, an issue for two reasons. First is the grid connection per se. So obviously, if there is not the connection to the grid, you cannot sell your electricity. So in some cases, some projects are ready, but they cannot connect. And the second, grids are a very important flexibility source, which is critically important to reliably and cost-effectively integrate variable renewables like solar and wind. Now, what can be done? First of all, I would say measures in two ways. First, implement and accelerate expansion and strengthening plans. In many places of the world, this is already done. There are very good plans existing. But then once again, give to those a very high policy priority and including measures. So for instance, in this moment, Europe is proposing some kind of exceptional procedures on permitting of renewables. It should be also be considered to expand these exceptional measures to the grid developing and strengthening. It has to be really understood that the strengthening of the grids and networks, both at the transmission level and also at the distribution level, are fundamental pillars of the clean energy transition for renewables, and not just for renewables, but also for the development of distributed electrification and uses like including heat pumps and electric vehicles. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paolo. There is another important question which I will bring Jeremy on the screen, and I'm sure, Paolo, you have a few words to say about this one. Does it really make sense, really sustainably, to produce biofuels from corn, maize, sugarcane, and many countries pay currently enormous prices for imported corn and maize, etc.? Does IEA has an own position on this sensitive topic? Maybe Jeremy, you can start, and Paolo, I'm sure you want to say a few words. Jeremy.
So I'll mention a few points. I mean, first, food security always comes first. And different countries design their biofuel policies in such a way to manage food security and energy security. So places like Brazil, the sugarcane that's being used to produce ethanol, those same facilities can switch between producing ethanol or producing sweeteners, depending on the price and the availability of sugars. And we've seen that over time in Brazil, where when there's an excess supply of sugar, there's more ethanol production. If there's less sugar supply and there's more demand for sweeteners, then some of that sugar goes towards that demand. So satisfying the need for food over the need for fuels. India is developing some of its policies in the same way, so that has that ability to switch between food and energy, depending on what's on more demand. So that's some of the ways that countries address that concern.
I would just reinforce what Jeremy just said. This is obvious that food security comes first. Now, ethanol is a bit better placed, actually, in this situation. The attention of the policymakers should be on, in particular, to more devoted to good land use management, which has as a goal to increase the productivity of land, to allow more production of food and more production of fuels when appropriate. But one position is clear: food security comes first.
Thank you, Paolo. There is one question about storage and long-term storage options for renewables acceleration. This year, we did not cover this in our report. Last year report, though, we published a forecast not only for battery storage, but also for pumped hydro storage and solar thermal storage, CSP. This year, we chose other topics to address, but we will definitely go back to it. But this question is very important, and it's important to expand those storage technologies, including all of them. Obviously, the battery storage is growing rapidly around the world, both at the residential level and at the commercial level, especially where the markets remunerate them. For instance, in the United States, several markets remunerate them, even at the very short-term capabilities to balance the grid, they actually can make money. In other markets, though, this is not valued. The price signals are extremely limited to provide flexibility sources, visibility. And maybe it's important to highlight here, as we did a special report on hydropower as well, Pumped hydro today accounts for more than 98% of the storage volumes in the world, including all the battery storage that is in every single electric vehicle in the world. So in terms of volumes, we are talking about a huge storage capability, but sustainability and operating those plants is not really has not been a good option because of the weak price signals in many parts of the world, notably in Europe in this case. So we need those dispatchable technologies such as hydropower, bioenergy, which can actually provide this kind of flexibility into the markets and could be in some cases cheaper than small battery storage options. So in terms of when you look at the lifetime cost of them, especially for pumped hydro. So I think we should consider again looking at those. And I think I'm answering two storage questions there. Please, Paul.
Can I just add one point? First, I would totally agree that in many markets, the value of storage is still not fully reflected and not fully remunerated, which is a barrier per se. Now, I would then make a distinction between distributed and in particular short duration storage like batteries attached to distributed PV and then the rest. We have anecdotal evidence that in some markets, due to the very high electricity prices, where investors can invest in solar PV rooftops, for instance, plus batteries, this is economic competitive right now. And a number of people investors will have. But at the same time, I would say that this is good, but it is not sufficient. And in the future, we will need a combination of distributed behind the meter storage and centralized storage. And here what Heimi said, that we need to focus more attention on this and to market and business models and also technology progress that will allow this to expand. And it will be increasingly important as the share of variable renewables increase. That will be a very important focus of attention from our side, but also from the policymakers and regulators in the near and in the mid future.
Thank you very much, Paula. Our time is up. We are over 6 minutes. There are still questions, and I see my colleagues are answering them written. I'll quickly summarize them. There's one question on geothermal power, which Trevor is being answered right now live. There's one question about the CSP. We include CSP in our forecast, and this is basically answered by Laura as we speak. And we will be answering anything that we did not answer. And there was one question on pumped hydro, which I answered also a few minutes ago. Besides that, I think we almost answered all the questions, including the topics related to biofuels and heat. And I would like to thank everybody for their patience. We went a bit longer than expected because there were like more than 25 questions that are being asked. Thank you very much for your interest. And most of you received our invitation to this webinar through our email account, which is also in our website. So you can write to us for next year's report what kind of new topics that you would like us to cover. Because every year, as you know, in addition to this typical forecast numbers that we generate, we also do a chapter 4, which basically explores trends, different trends and different analysis, which as a team, we enjoy a lot to develop this analysis. And we get a lot of feedback that this part is actually very interesting. So please help us choose some topics if you are interested. We will definitely take into account your questions for the next report and continue to follow ups. Our next report will be next May, probably a market update. We do it on the short term, and maybe a new topic that we will be publishing next year as well, besides market report. Obviously, the energy markets are in a crisis, and the topics are changing very quickly. We will try to follow up on those as quickly as we can. Thank you very much, everybody, and big thanks to the team who worked very hard on this report. Which basically dedicated a lot of days and nights, who you can see on the screen. right now. And thanks to all of you. Have a good day. And this is the end of the.
Thanks to you,
webinar.
Jaime. Thanks to you and to the team, and also to the whole audience from my part. Thank you. Have a nice afternoon, evening, or day, depending on where you are. Thank you.
Thank you.